All right, our next film is a biopic about Nikola Tesla. It is called, fittingly, Tesla. Written and directed by Michael Almereyda, who is probably best known for Hamlet, which also starred the star of this movie, Ethan Hawke. Ethan Hawke plays Nikola Tesla himself. We have a narrator, Eve Hewson, who also plays Anne Morgan. We also have Kyle MacLachlan playing Thomas Edison, Jim Gaffigan playing George Westinghouse. It's quite the cast. And this is ISC Films. It is right now in a limited theatrical release. I don't know if it's in drive-ins, but it is on video on demand. So you can rent it or buy it right now for the normal price. The film is, like I said, it's about Nikola Tesla's life, but it kind of tackles more of like the middle part of his life. And we sort of see like from when he was an employee for Thomas Edison to kind of like on the outs, like kind of like at the beginning of the 20th century. So we're looking at kind of a period of time between the mid 1880s to the early 1900s. And the film catalogs really like the fall, barely rise, fall again, slight modicum of rise of Tesla and his inventions. He's best known for inventing alternating electrical currents. And his big issue in history is that he never really got credit for a lot of the things that he inspired the invention of, including the radio, for example. The film, of course, touches on that. It touches on his rivalry with Thomas Edison in terms of patents and being able to get government and investor backing on all of his projects. And the movie kind of examines a person who, you know, some people kind of refer to Tesla as kind of just like this brilliant underdog, this guy who really got screwed over. This movie is kind of interesting because it tackles the sort of darker side of who Tesla apparently was. He was a bit of a recluse. He was very antisocial. His entire life was his inventions. And there's a dark, kind of complicated story to what this guy went through. And that's something this movie certainly has on its mind. The other thing it has on its mind is how do we make this not a boring biopic, and kind of doing everything possible to sort of like flash up the cinematography and filmmaking style to make it look like something very different than what you would expect from something like this. We've already gotten The Current War, which is a little bit more of a straightforward biographical film. And this one is just a lot weirder. There are certain scenes where you see like the backdrop of like it's clearly like a soundstage, and they're like purposely making it look like a Nostalgia Critic sketch. Like it's that kind of like production quality.
It's not really fair to Michael.
I'm sorry, but that's just kind of how I felt. Like literally,
I got more of a play vibe. Like
there's such a
like,
green screen vibe to it.
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, but like to me, like kind of the use of like kind of like drawn backgrounds and stuff like that. Like I got more of like a play vibe, like something like kind of more theatrical in that sense. But yeah, there are a couple of shots where it's like very like clearly green screen in a way that was like, oh, okay, well, I mean, I guess this is more of an aesthetic thing, or else the budget really ran out in this shot.
There's a lot of like contextualizing and breaking the fourth wall. I mentioned that Eve Hewson, who plays Anne Morgan, narrates the film. There are times when she literally stops the film in its tracks and is like, hey, let's do a Google search of Nikola Tesla. You know, it's just kind of like putting in all of these asides. Like it's like the movie is constantly trying to assure you that you are going to learn something about Tesla that maybe you didn't know before. I guess ultimately I was just a little disappointed by this movie. I just didn't find any of its quirks all that electric, I guess, to be that annoying pun person. I don't know. There was nothing about this movie that really just made me feel like it was worth the experience. It was just kind of like a ho-hum trying to be creative. But to me, it just looked like they were trying to cover up for a very, very low budget. So, but what did you think of this movie, Will?
Yeah, I'm kind of on the fence about it. I just watched it a couple hours ago, so it's still fresh in my mind. I mean, you didn't see The Current War, right?
I did not.
Yeah, I was gonna say. I mean, I knew we talked about it, or I talked about it, but I thought I didn't. You hadn't seen it, but I mean, it's hard not to compare it to that since that just came out like a year or so ago, and I do believe that film's kind of trying to do something pretty similar, where like the cinematography was super flashy and the editing was obviously trying to make it a little bit more modern. And I think this one, it does it in ways that I think when it works, it really works well in a way that like I didn't find those choices to be super gimmicky, because a lot of them were trying to express something that's, you know, obvious, but it kind of works for this project, which is like obviously he's ahead of his time, like thinking beyond like the confines of his time and what's available for him in like the early like 1900s or 1900 or whatever. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think in that sense, like it makes sense. It's a little on the nose, but I mean, I admire it for trying that. And if anything, I kind of wish it had more of those choices, because I could see some audiences being like, oh, like Thomas Edison's pulling out a smartphone, or like, Nikola Tesla is like singing karaoke now. And it's like those choices are weird and they take people out of it. But for me, like those choices are like, oh, okay, this is kind of drawing me in, because it's like this is a little bit different. It kind of gives it a little bit of a flash, a little bit something that like makes it stand out compared to other biopics. But I think it helps and hurts the project at the same time, because it's like those scenes stand out so well to the point where like the kind of more traditional biopic stuff kind of feels a little bit flatter and feels a little bit, like
Right.
it doesn't have the same spark, I guess, as those other moments where it clearly feels like the director is kind of trying to do something a little bit more playful, a little bit more intriguing. And yeah, like you said, the budget in this is I didn't really realize that going in, but it definitely feels apparent. And in a way that like you don't really want to criticize it too much, because it's like, it's a labor of love, and I imagine like, he put whatever money he had into the movie, so it's not like I think he like was trying to make it look cheap. I think it's just kind of like a side project of what he was going for. But I mean, it does unfortunately kind of give a like drunk history kind of feel at times, because it clearly is like a bunch of sets, and like we'll have like Jim Gaffigan be George Westinghouse, and I thought he did a fine job, but like it's a little jarring at first to be like, okay, that's not Jim Gaffigan, that's George
Yeah.
Westinghouse. And like a couple other comedic actors kind of pop in a way that kind of gives that drunk history feel, but I don't think it's intentional. But it does kind of make it a little harder to get into the project, and a little bit harder to kind of take it on its own terms and not look at it as like a movie or like something that's like trying to do a narrative dramatization of the story. And so I think that was my issue throughout the film, was that like I admire these choices throughout. Like that's the main thing I felt, was like I really appreciate what the movie's doing. I really like that he's trying to do something that's a little bit more off the cuff, but like a lot of these choices ultimately don't fully invest me into the story in a way that I felt like I could really grapple with like what's going on here and really relate to Tesla. Even though I do find this to be a pretty personal film for the filmmaker, it seems like Tesla's like troubled to earn funding, or like kind of like get his ideas off the ground through like
Yeah.
money. It seems like that's very much like a like autobiographical thing for the filmmaker. I mean, I haven't seen his other films, but that's just from what I've read and from what I've seen, that seems to be a pretty autobiographical choice for the film, and I like that, and I think that's an interesting idea. But yeah, like you, I find myself kind of on the fence as far as how successful I ultimately think it is.
I did see one of his last films, Marjorie Prime, and yeah, kind of like that. This movie, yeah, I think it's hard to make this particular criticism because Almereyda has worked on so many films, but this reminds me of the old adage of like you can't break the rules until you know what the rules are, and it just feels like this film breaks rules for the sake of it, and not really in a way that aids the story or advances the story. It just feels like it breaks rules to sort of get your attention, which I guess is a version of what you're saying.
I agree and don't.
Well, here's an example. This is the example that I used for my review for the young folks.
Okay.
There's a whole thing where we get introduced to Jim Gaffigan's character, where he's George Westinghouse, and the whole point of this character, like what makes this character interesting, is there's a paradox to him that he's a businessman and he's an inventor. But instead of letting the movie reveal that like weird personality through Jim Gaffigan's performance, it kind of just does all of the work at you right before you meet him. And it's like, it just does like a bunch of like vignettes of who this guy is, instead of just letting you naturally, organically experience this larger than life persona. So that's what I kind of mean. It's like, it's trying to like, hey, don't get bored. I'm going to explain this. Don't worry. It's like kind of like doing the Adam McKay and the Big Short thing, where we're like, we got to stop the movie in order to get something across. And that's the thing that like was jarring to me. And it was just like, I don't like it when you do this. Just let the story speak for itself.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess that's where I kind of agree and disagree in that. Like, yeah, I felt like those choices, they prevented me from really getting invested in the story, because the movie's constantly taking you out to like explain things. I agree with you in that respect. Like, I get that the movie is like constantly kind of doing like different things to push itself away from your traditional biopic format, to the point where it does kind of make the actual biopic stuff feel a little bit more artificial as a result. But I do think that the filmmaker knows what he's doing here more than you suggest. Like, I think those choices are very meticulous. Like, I think this is a project that's been in the works since like the 80s or so, and I think it was actually the first screenplay that he wrote. So it's like one that he's been tinkering with for a long time, and I think he put a lot of thought and a lot of creative energy into this. I just think that maybe because he's been sitting on it for so long or been working on it for so many years that like maybe it got a little overcooked in the process. Like maybe there was just so many things he was trying to do in such a short span of time that it didn't really fully communicate in a way that made it organic to the story. That's just my read of it, at least.
I think this is honestly one of the rare times where I think the ending of the movie is the best part of it. You know, I think that once you get to like the tennis court scene and this whole extended sequence featuring just like totally anachronistic Ethan Hawke just kind of going for it, all of that stuff was where I was like, see, this is subverting the biopic format in a way that I can connect. I can invest in the story through scenes like this. And it was the only time in the movie where I fully was able to do that. It sounds like there were a few times you were able to do it, but yeah, for me, it was probably a little bit more limited. I'm not sure.
I mean, yeah, it was real back and forth. Like, I think there's something to like the rollerblading scene, for instance, that's like kind of oddly charming in a way. Yeah, the ice cream stuff was fine. I wasn't really as crazy about that, but I appreciated from the onset just being like, oh yeah, okay, just so you know, we're gonna be a little weird with this. But yeah, like the pie eating scene, like that stuff. Like I think those moments stand out to me more on reflection than your kind of more traditional biopic elements, in a way that like those scenes kind of felt so traditional against the other parts of the film that they had a more artificial feel to it. Like I was saying, in a way that was like, it just kind of took me out of it in a way that I wasn't fully able to invest in the film, unfortunately. But like I said, I appreciate everything that he's doing. I think there's a lot of interesting ideas here, and I think he has a lot of reverence for Tesla, and he puts a lot of himself into this project in a way that makes it stand out compared to a kind of more, I guess, ho-hum biopic. But in the end, I just don't really think it connected with me as much as it did with some audiences that really enjoyed this thing.
I think this movie, it's so close to me being like, yes, and it did it. And we had a Tesla movie that I can be like, this is the Tesla movie you should watch. But yeah, not quite for me. I think this is like a C+. Like you, I do admire the effort. I admire swinging for the fences and just trying to do different things, not trying to do the same old biopic thing. But unfortunately, this just wasn't a movie that I thought did it as effectively as I think it could have. And in a lot of ways, it's kind of sad. It kind of like mirrors Tesla himself. I think that's pretty readily apparent to me that you can make a lot of comparisons between this movie and the person, which maybe that's sort of the point. I don't know. But yeah, C+ for me. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I land somewhere close to where he did with The Current War, which is a film I remember thinking like, this is almost there. Like, it's like a lot of the elements are working. Some scenes are fantastic. It just like the product itself in that case was like super messy. And I felt like it just didn't really come together in a way that I felt was worthy of all the passion and inspiration that went into the filmmaking of it. And this one, I'm similar but different. I'm like, I think it's a little bit more well-rounded. Like, I think the story itself is fine. I just think it just doesn't really indulge its weird side as much as I was hoping it would. Like, it does to a decent extent, to the point where it's like there's a lot of memorable scenes and a lot of things that I think will make this fresher on my mind than some other biopics I've seen of late that don't really try to do as many experimental things. But in the end, similar to you, I don't know if the choices themselves work as much as the filmmaker hoped they did. And I guess compared to some audiences, as much as some other people thought it did. So I'm really between a C+, a high C+, and a low B-. I think at this point, I'll give it a super low B- with the caveat that the grade could change by next week to a C+.
You're breaking your system, Will. I don't know. I'm getting scared. You're scaring me again.
I try and mix it up, you know. I'm like the filmmaker here. I try to do something a little different each time.
I appreciate that. All right, well, sort of a high-ish C+ for me, low B- for Will. It's just, yeah, it's really on the line there. I do recommend this to a lot of our listeners who are sort of completists, who are film buffs. Maybe you really like Ethan Hawke and First Reformed and a lot of his more indie performances. Yeah. I think it is worth watching just sort of as like an experimentation effort.
Yeah, I will say, though, that like if you're watching the trailer for this and you're like, wow, this is really whizzy, it's like doing something that's going to be revolutionary, just keep in mind that a lot of the like kind of more experimental stuff is in the trailer. Like, I watched the trailer after I saw the movie. I was like, they kind of gave away a lot more things than I anticipated.
I never saw the trailer, so yeah, I didn't.
I'll just give that caveat real quick, I guess. But, you know, I would recommend overall, like I said. I think it's interesting enough that like, if you think it's your thing, check it out, because it might very well work for you as it did for a lot of people. But I still find myself with a couple caveats myself.